Welcome to the second Open Talks in History. My name is Paul Lawrence. I'm the head of history. I'm delighted to be in a position to introduce my colleague, Dr. Neil Younger. So Neil's been with the Open University for about 5 years now, I think, Neil. He's a specialist in Elizabethan England, in the kind of intersection between politics and religious history. He's currently chairing a new course in production, excitingly titled Revolutions. So keeping him busy there, but he's found time to come and give this talk to us today. Neil's also working at the moment on a new book about Christopher Hatton, who was an Elizabethan courtier and politician. I asked Neil to tell me some exciting things about Christopher Hatton that I could put into this brief intro, and he said he's put all the exciting things in the talk. So I think for that, I will hand you over now to Neil. Neil's going to speak for about 30 minutes. Then I'm going to pop back up afterwards and I'll field some questions and we'll take some questions online. So thanks very much. I hand over to you, Neil.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for coming, or as it may be, tuning in online. And thanks as well to Richard Marsden for organising this series of talks and assigning me this topic. I say that because I am sort of giving an early modern contribution to this series of talks, which is sort of loosely focused around our relationship with Europe. So you won't be surprised if I get into the B word topic quite quickly, but we'll start with something a little more backgroundy. So I think the relationship of 16th century Europe, 16th century England with Europe is in many ways very comparable with that in earlier and later periods. We had clearly crucial trade links with Europe in terms of both imports and exports. We had deep cultural and intellectual links, and European ideas and technologies and fashions were closely followed by those in England who could access them. Henry VIII was certainly deeply enthralled to his French counterparts and imitated them in many ways. The development of printing and the spread of the Renaissance amplified this greatly. When Henry VII wished to adorn his court, he turned to Italians, such as the historian Polydore Virgil, who was commissioned to write a history of the reign, and the sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, who produced Henry's tomb in Westminster Abbey. And of course, we have a great deal of travel and intercourse between England and Europe. I think it's probably true to say that in certain ways, 16th century England had, in certain ways, less to do with Europe than was the case in earlier and later periods. In earlier periods, we can point to much more direct connections, such as the Viking kings who ruled in both Scandinavia and England, the conquest of this country by a French ruler in 1066, the deep engagement with France during the 100 Years' War. In later periods, we have, of course, the union with Scotland. And I should apologise that in this lecture I'm mostly speaking about England, but there is some non-English material as well. We have as well the union of England with, under the rule of a Dutch prince, and later on ruled by a series of princes from Germany who were simultaneously rulers of a medium-sized German state, Hanover. And correspondingly, military interventions within Europe were relatively low-key during the 16th century. Although virtually all the Tudor monarchs went to war in Europe for periods, they were seldom existential conflicts that we might compare to the Napoleonic Wars, for example, and they could virtually be turned on or off at will. The exception there perhaps being the Elizabethan Wars against Spain at the end of the century, which I bring up because that was the subject of my doctoral research, and do please buy my book. But essentially, England continued in its long-standing position as an important state, if not quite one of the first rank, occupying a slightly peripheral position as part of a community of Christendom, inhabiting the peninsula of Europe and distinguishing itself from the Islamic areas to the south and east, and to a lesser extent from the Orthodox countries to the northeast. And of course, it was very much considered part of that community of Christendom, which was held in unity by its adherence to the papacy in Rome, the successor of St. Peter. But of course, obviously, we do have one very major development in this period, which will form the central topic of this talk, which is the Reformation of religion. And because it's 2019 and the entire country can think of nothing else, I'm afraid I brought some Brexit into it. And I think there's some justification for doing so, because there's been quite a popular comparison between these two events. "I'm not the original Brexiteer, that was Henry VIII, said Nigel Farage, quoted in The Guardian a few weeks ago. So I've tried to think about this comparison and assess whether it seems to work. And I think to a certain extent it does work. Let's look at the situation, and I'll put up a backdrop of Henry VIII glowering at us. So let's look at the situation. London has a problem. In certain influential quarters, there is the perception of a major difficulty in relations with the powers that be in Europe. The Prime Minister is delegated to negotiate a solution. He works at it for years and years, trying every possible argument to get his way, but no convincing solution emerges. Eventually, in frustration, the decision is taken simply to sever relations, to take back control, sacrificing, along the way, the Prime Minister in question. And we split from Europe, and everyone lives happily ever after. As I'm sure you've noticed, I'm telling the story both of Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey's dealings with the Church of Rome in the early 16th century, and with David Cameron's travails in the 21st. And I confess I cheated a little, because although Cardinal Wolsey was Prime Minister in effect, he never had that title. And of course I made up the bit about everyone living happily ever after, but we'll come back to that. And you may also have noticed in this slightly clumsy analogy that in order to make it work, you have to choose your words quite carefully. Tudor England is not the same as the modern UK. Decisions today proceed not from the will of the king, but from Parliament or from the people, as the case may be. But the comparison kind of works, and it apparently works well enough for quite a few modern writers on all sides of the debate. So let's look first at the process of Reformation and come back to the question of whether the comparison is meaningful later on. If we look at Henry VIII's Reformation, it was originally centred on questions of jurisdiction. That is to say, could Henry have a divorce? And this is a story that's of course very well known, but by the middle of the 1520s, Henry's family tree is starting to look rather barren. He has no sons and no brothers. He's getting older. He felt an acute need to secure the succession. And he wanted to do that by getting rid of his old wife and getting a new wife. And harsh and unfeeling as that was, it was not a completely unreasonable position. The Wars of the Roses was still very much within living memory, and no one wanted a renewal of civil war. So of course he needed a divorce, which had to be granted by the Pope, and under normal circumstances, it seems likely that the Pope would have obliged. Popes generally liked to gratify kings where they could. But of course the Pope was prevented from doing so by the political considerations that the Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, happened to be the most powerful ruler in Europe, Charles V, and he did not want this. So Cardinal Wolsey is delegated to negotiate a divorce, and he eventually fails, and this ultimately is why the breach of Rome has to happen, for this rather banal reason that would allow Henry to reject papal authority, install his own Archbishop of Canterbury, and get a divorce. And it seems very likely to me that were it not for his marital difficulties, Henry VIII would never have contemplated such a move. He was, of course, brought up as a devout Catholic. He had already opposed the reformers in Germany and written a book, or at least put his name to a book, excoriating Martin Luther, for which he'd been rewarded by the Pope with the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith, which, as I'm sure we all know, we still find on our coins to this day. Yet when he came to possess the new powers he assumed over the church, he seems to have found that he rather liked them. They are embodied, after all, in the text of one of his parliamentary statutes that I took as the title of this paper, noting that this realm of England is an empire. It acknowledged no superior. Henry acknowledged no superior. And who wouldn't rather be an emperor than a king? And Henry's actions and sort of inclinations here form part of much broader patterns of the ways in which early modern monarchies was working to strengthen their powers. As communications improved, it became increasingly possible for rulers to extend the way that they exercised over their power over their people and cut out the middlemen. So the power of the nobility was attacked. As we've seen, the power of the church was attacked, both the church within England itself and the Church of Rome. Both were to be made subject to the king, the church and the nobility. Governance grew increasingly complex and sophisticated. Uniformity of government was rolled out across the king's territories. Parliament grew more active as a representative both of the royal will and of the consent of the nation. We see developments such as the government of Wales and the parts of the north of England being brought into line with that of the Tudor heartland in southern and Midland England, and attempts to do the same in Ireland. Of course, all of this needed more money, and this need was manifested in the dissolution of the monasteries and seizure of church lands and goods by the crown, and the diversion of taxes on the clergy from Rome to the exchequer. So power is being drawn from both overseas and from more local levels within Henry's realm towards the king. And I think we see this manifested in the shift in the way Henry's depicted in portraiture. This portrait from very early in the reign, showing Henry as a relatively youthful man, shows him, I think, as wealthy, certainly, and possibly good-looking. It's hard to judge. But he's not shown in anything like this sort of powerful stance that we see in the later post-Reformation portraits. I think this expresses visually this changing sense, which I think is quite a profound but a very elusive sense in which the status of the monarchy has been deliberately and quite markedly enhanced with the aim, obviously, of strengthening the power of the king. And clearly this is one of the things that Henry is doing as he seeks to make his realm of England an empire. But of course, he could have done all of this without splitting from Rome. And we know that because most other European monarchs did very similar things. Here on the left, for example, is Philip II on his funeral monument, the most powerful ruler of late 16th century Europe and a devoted ally of the Pope. On the right is Louis XIV, not noticeably groaning under the servitude of the Pope in that particular image. The French kings, of course, stayed within the fold of the Roman Church, but expanded their own power within it at the expense of the Pope's power. So there are difficulties here, but we can see very obvious parallels between this question and our current situation with the desire for powers to be returned to Westminster. But I think it is a meaningful point that Henry VIII sought power primarily for himself as a divinely ordained monarch, not for the people as a whole. And in general terms, we would probably not want to live in such a system. So I think Henry was not driven primarily by concepts of national control or hostility to Europe, and still less with concerns for democracy. He was driven by the desire to augment his own power. Now, of course, this is not the first time that the power of the church had clashed with the power of European rulers. It's a common situation that these two powerful entities in early modern Europe, the church and the crown, would come into conflict. Popes and kings quarreled. And under normal circumstances, it seems reasonably likely or plausible that Henry or his successor would have patched up the quarrel with the Pope sooner or later, as indeed his daughter Mary I successfully did a couple of decades later. But of course that didn't happen to a large extent because of what seems to me to be a very strange, in some ways, world historical coincidence, which was that at this time, the strongest challenge that the papacy had ever faced was rising in Germany. The movement led from 1517 by Martin Luther, which rejected the power of the Pope, to be sure, but rejected much more as well, including central tenets of the Catholic religion. It changed doctrine as well as jurisdiction. So Henry had a template to take up and allies in his anti-papal position. The cause of Lutheran or Protestant reform was not a widely popular group in England at this point, but it had some important followers among the intellectual elite, and during Henry's campaign for the divorce, they formed ready allies for him. most obviously Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. And naturally, they sought to persuade Henry to follow Luther, not merely in cutting off the Pope's jurisdiction, but in other ways as well. So as well as these sort of largely invisible jurisdictional changes with which Henry had begun, he actually begins to make substantive changes in the nature of English religious practice as well. Initially relatively small ones, the English Bible, for example, but under Henry's son, Edward VI in particular, these become much more extensive and decisively move England away from Catholic practice, and England begins to emerge as a Protestant nation. So the Reformation in England became much more far-reaching than was perhaps originally intended. We might like to think that Henry's initial position was something like a Norway option, separation but with essentially the same rules in place, whereas over time he developed into more of a Canada-like position with more meaningfully different rules and much more of a divergence. So I very much focused so far on the question of Henry VIII himself and his motivations for change on the very elite level of discourse. But of course, in comparison with Brexit, we have a very different picture, because the whole point about Brexit is that it was driven and is driven by a popular mandate. Obviously, some of those who agitated for a referendum and advocated a leave vote are by any measure elite, MPs, ministers, and so on. But most of the elite was against it. And the driving force, the impetus for change, the reason why it cannot be easily altered by Parliament comes from the direct vote of the electorate. The majority of the people wanted it. So to what extent was that the case in the 16th century? It certainly used to be argued that the Reformation was very much driven by popular support, that it was a popular movement at the start. Because for a very long time it was argued that the Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages, the period prior to the Reformation, was not a popular or a healthy institution. It was corrupt. The priests were lazy and unlearned. They slept with their housekeepers. The monks and friars were fat and drunken. Services were a mere mockery, mumbled in Latin, which the parishioners did not understand and hidden away behind rood screens. The populace were ignorant and superstitious, held in order only by gruesome wall paintings of hell and damnation. Even as a rising middle class of educated people thirsted for knowledge, this was a nation ripe for change. And of course, in some eyes, this picture of corruption and laziness can be transposed from Rome to Brussels. But in consequence, the argument went, when Protestantism presented itself, it was greeted warmly. The old church was shrugged off. Henry's reforms were embraced. The new services in English were listened to attentively. A quick and popular Reformation brought about with the support of the people. But this view, which largely held until perhaps the 1980s, has more recently been much revised. A great deal of research has challenged the notion that the medieval church was unpopular. Of course, there were complaints about it, as there are complaints about virtually any institution. There was some popular anti-clericalism. There was resentment of harsh church landlords or whatever. It was not perfect. But people had a great deal of affection for the church. They participated actively and enthusiastically in its ceremonies and practices, and they were proud of their parish churches. As you would perhaps expect, 16th century people were conservative and did not yearn for radical change. And consequently, it's been argued that the English Reformation was in fact much more strongly driven from above, by the monarchy and the elite. It was a long and slow process, by no means a universally popular one, and one which became real only over a generational time span. It's been argued that it was perhaps only by the 1590s, 60 years or more after the initial steps in the process, that the English can be described as a meaningfully Protestant people. And there remained a substantial Catholic or Catholic-leaning minority in England for a very long time. As I've argued in my own recent research, Elizabeth I's government was far from universally composed of strong Protestants. Christopher Hatton, who, as Paul mentioned, I'm working on at the moment, is a leading Elizabethan minister who became Lord Chancellor, but is someone who is a patron of Catholics on a massive scale in his household, among his own family, among his tenants, servants, clients, his academics whom he patronized and so on, we found a huge number of Catholics. England, certainly, even at that elite level, has not become solidly and uniformly Protestant, even by the 1580s or 90s. So we have a clear sense here of how changes in historians' views of the past can quite radically alter our perception of what was really going on. This is a very major change in our interpretation of the Reformation. And furthermore, historians have become increasingly aware that the Reformation was not something that took place over a few years in the 1530s. It was a very long process, with many loose ends that took decades to resolve. It divided the country for a very long time. We look ahead to the 17th century, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, or the English Civil Wars, which are intimately tied up with religious issues, issues which were complicated further by the Union of the Crowns in 1603. The English Civil Wars, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, were, after all, kicked off by a rebellion over religion in Scotland. We have the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is deeply concerned with religion too, in particular, of course, the problem of James II's Catholicism. And even as late as 1714, with the exclusion of the Stuarts from the throne and the invitation of the Hanoverians to be rulers of England and Scotland, Wales and Ireland, this is based on a religious litmus test. Nearly 2 centuries after the beginning of the Reformation, religion is still disrupting the English constitution. So it was slow. The Reformation was slow and not easy, but it was certainly real. And certainly, over time, Protestantism did become deeply embedded in the nation. And alongside that, the English people came to fear and hate Catholicism and the idea of the papacy very strongly. We have the phenomenon of anti-Catholicism or anti-popery, an attitude which at times was so intense as to be almost irrational and paranoid. Arguments that the Pope was literally the Antichrist, that the Catholic powers of Europe were conspiring against England, and so on. And of course, we can see some explanations for this. The English Reformation, as we've seen, was slow and difficult. Some English people remained Catholic, and some of those people acted upon their beliefs. We have plots against Elizabeth I. We have the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. We have people who threatened to collaborate with the Spanish invaders in 1588. All of these events seem to have stoked anti-Catholicism, fear, and hatred. And this persisted for centuries. We can see the Spanish Armada of 1588 as a turning point in other ways too. It's sometimes seen as the prelude to the British Empire, to the period of buccaneering trade and sort of, adventurism of the English turning away from Europe, going out into the world and making their way in the world. Of course, it's questionable how far that distinguishes the UK from Europe. Clearly, the French and even more the Dutch provide obvious comparisons in both of those spheres. And it's easy to forget that when Henry VIII was sending great armies to conquer small towns in France, the subjects of the Spanish King Charles V, or the Emperor Charles V, were constructing a great empire for him in Central and South America and the Far East. And his galleons would sail from Acapulco in Mexico across the Pacific to Manila to mark out the first empire on which the sun never set. The English were slow in getting started in this. But I think we see in this shift of the Reformation from these initial questions of jurisdiction and power to questions of religious doctrine and practice, we increasingly get a sense of a meaningful divergence of English culture and people from Catholicism. A sense growing perhaps that Britain or England, it's often difficult to pin down which is being discussed at any one moment, is fundamentally different from Europe, has a different history, and that the notion that we should be part of the EU is a historical anomaly. We have this British exceptionalism that taps into this narrative that Protestantism encouraged hard work, the Protestant work ethic, that Protestantism encouraged literacy and capitalism and entrepreneurship, adventurousness, exploration, all of these things which also connect us with the United States, by contrast to which Catholic Europe was lazy and superstitious and so on. Now, whether or not this is the case, I'm not at all sure the Reformation made it so. For one thing, the Reformation was scarcely an English or a British invention. After all, it originated in Germany, of course, and important currents developed in Switzerland as well. So if Protestant Britain is thought to be intrinsically different from Catholic Europe, where does this leave Protestant Germany, Protestant Netherlands, Protestant Scandinavia, and so on? So, was the Reformation at all comparable to Brexit? I think at the most basic level, there are parallels with taking back control, of ceasing to have power over English affairs exercised outside the realm. But once we get into any level of detail, the comparison becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. At the most basic level, if you're a Christian, decisions over what religion to follow relate to the question of the fate of one's immortal soul between salvation and damnation, in comparison to which trade legislation may seem relatively trivial. And this at least accounts for one very attractive characteristic of the current debate, which is the lack of executions and burnings at the stake. So why does this comparison persist? I think there are several reasons. Surely an important one is that there's a very sort of obvious, simple geographical fit. It is us against Europe. It's the appeal of being sturdily independent, and independence is an appealing virtue. There is a superficial comparison, a kind of truthiness to it. It's close enough to look meaningful, despite the fact that the us in the 16th century included all of Ireland and none of Scotland, and the Europe in the 16th century was not Brussels but Rome, not a political and economic union, but a religious one. At another level, I think the comparison offers a convenient debating point to say, we did it before, we can do it again. And again, it assumes that we, possibly meaning the English, possibly meaning the whole of the UK, are in some mystical sense the same people as we were 500 years ago, which again I think is questionable. Arguably a better comparison with Brexit is not the Reformation, but the Scottish independence debate, which in practical terms is much more similar. I had a look, but there seem to be relatively few comparisons between the Scottish independence process and the Reformation. So, to sort of move towards a conclusion, I have to confess, when I agreed to give this talk, I didn't really have a clear sense of what its argument would be. I hadn't tried to systematically think through the implications of the parallel between the Reformation and the process of leaving the EU. So, in that sense, it's been worthwhile trying to do that, though I'm not sure how successful it's been. As has perhaps become evident, I'm sceptical that the Reformation forms a very useful comparison point. The events are too far off. They're too different in nature. The political and ideological forces and actors are too complex and interconnected in each case to make comparisons meaningful. I think if one studies politics, as I do, both in my day job, studying 16th century politics and following current politics, one tends to come to the conclusion that political situations are very hard to compare with each other because the particularities are crucially important and are very seldom comparable in meaningful ways. Still less does history give us any helpful advice as to how to move forward. If Henry VIII were here, I'm sure he could usefully execute a few ministers, but beyond that, the experience of the 16th century Reformation suggests that the best course of action may be to wait a couple of generations and hope that things settle down a bit. This is not, of course, to suggest that history gives us no useful lessons here. The exercise of making comparisons, the exercise, the practice of doing it, helps us to understand what precisely is going on in particular places and times. But my sense is that the Reformation is not necessarily the right historical frame of reference. I think these debates, these contemporary debates, actually owe more to more recent history, Britain's history of empire and of its relations with Europe in the 20th century. And here perhaps the interesting feature, or the curious feature, is not so much on the UK side, inasmuch as patriotism or nationalism is not a strange or surprising thing. Arguably, the more strange and surprising thing is the willingness on the EU side to set those instincts aside and create or accept something like the EU. I'm tempted to say, or I was tempted to say, that the only prediction I'd care to make is that, like the Reformation, this process is likely to go on for a very long time. But in fact, I'm not sure about that either. It may be that the issue was resolved one way or another before too long, and we find that actually not all that much has changed, and we move on to thinking about something else. Let's hope. In this context, I'm reminded of some words of William Wentworth, a Yorkshire gentleman who wrote a document of advice to his son in 1604. So we have to replace religion with whatever else we want. For points of religion, rather be in conversation, by which he means a manner or bearing or behaviour religious, than speak earnestly against the Catholics. He stood out against the anti-Catholicism of his own time. For they be very learned and wise men, and can say much for their cause. They hold the same fundamental points that we do. Only ambition, pride, and covetousness, and want of charity do cause this hateful contention. I fear there are elements of all of those sins in our current debate, and we could probably do more of the moderation of William Wentworth. Thank you.
Neil, almost you said you were going to speak for half an hour. I think you did exactly. So
Thank you.
Not often that happens. So we have a little bit of time for some questions while everyone in the room is gathering any thoughts they want to put to Neil. Chris, have we got a question from online?
Yes, I have a couple. The first one is a question from Dr. Richard Marsden.
Who?
He says, I've never heard of him either. His point is that you're using the word empire, and perhaps to describe something that's different from a kingdom. Could you maybe go into a bit more detail about what you mean by that term empire, and also by what contemporaries in the 16th century were referring to the Holy Roman Empire, to an idea of the Roman Empire itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of getting at the issue which I would raise, that it's a vague term in the 16th century. It's not a sort of technical term, as it were. I think, as I mentioned, this is a phrase that's used in the Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1532, which bases Henry's claims on sundry old authentic histories and chronicles, I think is the phrase. So he's saying that, what we're doing is putting things right. England used to be an empire, and we are making it back into an empire, by which he means that they will accept no superior from abroad. And in that context, he's referring to the Pope on one level, but he's also referring to the very sort of vague remaining notions that the Holy Roman Emperor, the ruler of Germany, who claimed to be the successor of the ancient Roman emperors, had a kind of vague, loosely defined sovereignty over other European monarchs. And I think at that point, nobody would have believed that that was a credible claim. So I think you might argue that what Henry's Parliament is saying in 1532 is a bit of a sort of straw man argument, because so it is quite an interesting point. But I think it is trying to assert greater claims. I mean, as I argued in the piece, I think this is a period where the status of kings is being very actively and deliberately enhanced. And there's this attempt to take on real practical powers, not just sort of theoretical powers. And I think this helps to articulate one part of what Henry was trying to do there.
Thanks. Yeah. Anyone in the room want to jump in? Or if not, I've got a quick question. So I like the way, in a sense, in the current Brexit debate, it seems to me there's the two big things that people kind of focus on are either the kind of points you were talking about, like who's in charge ultimately, whereas, in that sense, the papacy in your period is something like the European Court of Justice. It's like we don't want something else telling us what to do. So there's those sorts of arguments. But at the moment, there's also a lot of what's best for the economy kind of arguments. So in terms of the changes that you're talking about, I mean, how interconnected were the economies of Britain and Europe? Is this a kind of thing that people discuss and worry about in the period?
Yeah, I mean, it is. And it's something that causes difficulties in English trade. I mean, England, as I'm sure we know, is still overwhelmingly an agrarian society. It's still, to a large extent, subsistence farming. But there is you've got sort of perhaps 10% of the population who are engaged on one level in trade. The obvious one that's always quoted is the export of wool. We get a great growth in wool growing in England. Much of it's exported to, various parts of the continent, but in particular the Netherlands, to Antwerp, a bit later on to Amsterdam, earlier on to Bruges. So yeah, I mean, it's not a massive element of the economy, but it does bring in quite a lot of revenue in terms of, you know, tariffs or customs dues or whatever, and it's quite a lot of employment. And at times, it is interrupted by this sort of by religious tension, by embargoes of one kind or another. I'm not sure. I haven't done the sums on whether there are more interruptions to trade from religious issues or whether there are more interruptions over war. So you'd have to work that out, but it certainly doesn't help.
Yeah. Thank you. Chris, another question online? Yeah.
There's a question here that arrived before the lecture, so it almost is an opportunity to ask if you want to repeat the lecture. But I think it sets it out quite nicely. Does the precedent set by the 1534 Act of Supremacy confirm England is better at creating its own rather than joining other international political unions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. International political unions, well, they're not, of course it depends what you mean by that, doesn't it? There aren't many international political unions. I mean, I guess we're in one with Scotland and Ireland, or Northern Ireland and Wales. We're in a separate one in the EU, and really that's about it. You know, we're in NATO, but I don't think you'd really call that an international political union. I think what I would say is that we may or may not be, or this country may or may not have doubts about international political unions, but the Reformation doesn't prove that one way or the other. That's what I'm trying to get at in this lecture. Whatever you believe to be true, it's not necessarily a good idea to project it onto the events of 500 or more years ago.
Yes, I think in a sense what I took from some of your talk was the sense to make a reductive or simplistic comparison is very tempting.
Yes.
But really it's just a way of avoiding facing up to some complexity in the present.
Yes.
Say, oh, it's just much simpler.
And we see this in the sort of subsequent, or you know, the intertwining debates between Scottish nationalism and the question of membership of the EU, where many of the same arguments are made to prove precisely opposite conclusions. You know, it's good to be in a union, it's bad to be in a union. Which union do you mean? Oh, that good union's good, but that one's not. You know, people can tie themselves into quite considerable knots over this question.
I mean, for those who aren't as familiar with your period, in the current Brexit kind of times, you know, often TV news crews go out to the man or woman in the street and say, what do you reckon? And they say, oh, well, either they give a strong opinion or they just say, I couldn't care less, I've had enough of it. You know, the average kind of person in the lane, in the kind of, in this period, would they care? Would they know this? Is this a big thing that's happening that everyone's talking about because they know about it? Or is it just communicated to them after the fact?
Well, I think they very much did care, yeah. I mean, I think this is sort of comes back to the distinction I made between these very sort of abstract jurisdictional changes that we get in the start, where, you know, crossing out the word pope and putting king over the top of it, you know, it doesn't affect people's lives in a great many ways. You know, some elite people were extremely angry about it or whatever, opposed it, but it doesn't affect most people very much. But we certainly get, you know, a number of major rebellions over the issue. Most obviously in 1536, the Pilgrimage of Grace in the north of England, which is a huge movement, and further rebellions sort of right through the century. And I think you see more noticeably that once these changes are coming down to what is actually happening in your parish church, this becomes much more obvious, much more present to individual people, and, you know, often it leads them to protest in one way or another. Sometimes it leads them to defy the government in one way or another, and it really does take a very long time to impose these things. You know, changing changing a religion is a hard thing to get your head around, I think. I mean, how do you change your religion at will? How do you unbelieve something which you formerly believed? And I'm not sure you really can do that successfully until you have people who've been born and brought up their entire lives in this one religion.
Yeah, and I certainly think that the picture you're giving of it's only after the fact, when the daily ramifications of what's been decided start to be worked through, that you see the kind of turbulence coming in, is probably a prediction that you could effectively make.
This brings us on to a question we just received online. Henry VIII was very naturally, for the time, an autocratic ruler. Notwithstanding this, what effort did he and his courtiers make to bring his nobles or the people on side regarding the separation from Rome?
I mean, there are efforts. You know, there are sort of. I mean, there are probably two different questions. You know, one speaking to the elite, one to sort of ordinary people. Certainly, if you know, there are examples of sort of widespread mass propaganda, of sort of royal proclamations, of royally sponsored publications. There's one very early one with the title of was sort of tracked against the muttering papists in corners, or something like that. This is sort of, you know, these people complaining about what the king was doing are being criticised. So yeah, there are significant efforts. I mean, I think in terms of getting the elite to behave, clearly a number of sort of salutary executions can be very effective. The cases of Thomas More and John Fisher are obviously very powerful examples of this. Most of the nobility or the elite, the landed elite, sort of accept matters reasonably well. I mean, one of the difficulties, I guess, for them, one of the difficulties for anyone protesting, is that the thing continually changes. I mean, you know, even across Henry's reign, through into Edward VI's reign, through into Mary's, through into Elizabeth, you know, every year, every 2 years, there is a new development, a new change in one direction or another. And I imagine this probably somewhat reduced the inclination to protest, because, you know, where is the end point going to be? And the end point does kind of come in 1559 with the Elizabethan settlement, where at least they stop changing what things are supposed to be happening and start trying to make them actually happen in that way. So yeah, I mean, it is a question which completely changes the nature, not completely, but it radically changes the nature of political life. And this is one of the things I'm studying at the moment. Just, you know, for all of recorded history, really, until the Reformation, political life is largely about, you know, looking after yourself, getting your own way, getting your promotion, you know, just doing what we do, trying to get by. And then, of course, you know, there are no ideological issues. People in early 16th century England don't debate ideological issues. The world is as it is, and one accepts it. And all of a sudden, we get, you know, the Reformation sort of, you know, cracks the egg into 1,000 pieces, and there is an issue to disagree about. And it's not just two positions, it's innumerable variations of those positions. And the question paralyzes English political life for, well, as I was saying, you know, arguably for 2 centuries.
Okay, well, I hope it's not going to take quite that long. Sylvia, yeah.
I wonder if you can say a bit more about what Europe was at that time, because at some point it looked like we were sort of Europe was basically papacy, it was Catholic Europe, it was Rome. Yet you started by saying that at the court of Henry VIII there were artists, and you know, we all know how important the model of courts in France and Italy were for English people, and how long that continued to be the case. So much so that well after the Reformation, Shakespeare sets his play in Verona, and St. Paul is modelled after St. Peter in Rome. So I suppose my question is, how do you see this cultural relationships between England and a sort of increasingly isolated England, you know, willing to look out across the oceans, which in fact was in a way continuously having relationship with Europe, which wasn't one entity, but there were all these different countries developing culturally, economically, and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, England does, after the Reformation, remain integrally part of Europe. I mean, it really doesn't change. You know, largely speaking, trade continues as before. Largely speaking, certainly wars continue as before. Certainly cultural exchanges continue. I mean, it becomes slightly more difficult for Protestants to travel in Catholic Europe at certain times. It becomes difficult for them to worship, for example, and obviously the reverse is true for Catholics in England. So, you know, there are elements of barriers being put up, but I mean, as you say, Europe remains an extremely present, you know, part of the mindset of early modern people, and I don't think there's any breach in that whatsoever. Certainly, you know, Elizabeth continues to, you know, have sort of Europeans at her court and so on. I mean, one of the interesting things is the way in which the Tudor royal family sort of slightly cut themselves off because there are, you know, not so many marriages. You know, the Tudors are very English in their, you know, Elizabeth is very English. Both of her parents are English. You know, Henry marries a couple of foreign wives, but 4 English people, which is quite unusual. But then once we get into the 17th century, it's back to marrying into the French royal family, the Portuguese, and so on and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a much more complex story. And I suppose when I was talking in my talk, the notion of sort of eliding Europe and Rome is purely as a way of sort of entangling or disentangling this issue over how the two stories of the Reformation and Brexit can be seen as comparable. And as I argued, really, they're probably not, really.
Chris, have you got a couple of...
Yes, I've got 2 more lined up. The first is to do with mentalities, but thinking about Henry VIII himself. To what extent do you believe that his drive to take power away from Rome reflected a feeling of his own inferiority via Francois I and Charles V, and a need to fortify himself politically against them?
I mean, I think he does feel, he does have a bit of an inferiority complex against monarchs like Francis and Charles, who, you know, his country is smaller, it is poorer, it has fewer people, you know, something which is obviously not necessarily the case with the UK now. England in this period is relatively significantly smaller than say, France. But, yeah, and as I say, he certainly very much measured himself up against them, tried to compete with them, and it's always sort of faintly embarrassing because he's not quite on that level. But I would tend to say that I don't really accept the premise of the question, because I think you have to take your counterfactual. If it weren't for the divorce issue, would Henry VIII ever have dreamt of doing something so radical and unnecessary as cutting off papal jurisdiction? And I don't see any reason to think that he would have done that.
And this brings us on to the final question I've got lined up, which is, how important was the fact that the Pope had already given a dispensation for Henry to marry his brother's widow, in the Pope then refusing to grant his divorce?
Well, I don't want to get into all the details, partly because I'll almost certainly get them wrong. I think it does sort of highlight a point that I raised near the beginning, that Henry almost certainly didn't expect this response from the Pope. What he was asking for was not really unreasonable. Everyone, you know, kings, popes, emperors accepted that it would be a good thing if Henry VIII had a son, had a stable successor, and didn't lapse back into civil war again, as it had done for 30 or 40 years at the end of the previous century. You know, he could reasonably have accepted expected to have been allowed to do this. And the fact that he didn't, or that he wasn't, is the more surprising thing here. And I think it sort of highlights the accident, the cock-up theory of history quite neatly.
Any other final questions? Yes.
So we're hearing a lot at the moment about the European view as well as the British view. What was the European view after the Reformation? Were they horrified or delighted? Or
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm sure they were horrified, but I mean, obviously, it comes in the context of the rise of Lutheranism in Germany, which sort of, you know, which had obviously occurred sort of 15 years or so previously, and is already a reasonably well-recognised feature on the map. And I think it you know, came as perhaps a surprise that Henry VIII had to do this, but he fell into a category by that point. And I mean, you know, obviously, we know that Protestantism becomes dominant in a comparatively small area of Europe. I mean, most of the major European monarchies remain Catholic, the French, the Spanish, the Austrian Habsburgs, the whole of Italy, and so on. But of course, it wasn't clear that was what was going to happen at the time. We have, certainly somewhere like France, has a huge population of Protestants within it, who spend the whole of the later 16th century having, I think officially it's 9 religious wars with French Catholics about the future religion of France. So, you know, this is a time of sort of deep uncertainty across Europe, where it's really not clear which way a lot of countries are going to go. I mean, as I say, when Mary comes to the throne in 1553, there was every expectation that she would live a reasonably long life, return England to Catholicism, and, you know, it would never have happened. So we'd all be speaking Latin, which would be handy, because my Latin's dreadful.
Thank you. Okay, so I think if there's no more questions, I will call us to a close here. I'd like to thank everyone watching online and in the room for attending. We very much hope to see you at future Open Talks in History. Drawing on your presentation, Neil, we've either got ahead of us potentially 200 years of turbulent working out of decisions being taken, or, you know, a very short period where nothing much will change. So,
I mean, we're already 3 years into it, so it's only 197 years.
197 to go. Okay, so we'll just thank Neil again, and thank you for attending.